Mafia boss's maid tried to get fired on purpose. He saw through her plan and made her his wife. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Maria was always a quiet, hardworking woman. At 25, she had been working as a maid in the Romano estate for over a year, but she had one goal in mind: get fired. Every day, she would push the limits, do something wrong, something out of place, hoping that her boss would notice and finally get rid of her. But nothing ever worked. Every time she expected to be dismissed, the Mafia boss, Alejandro Romano, would simply watch her with those cold, calculating eyes and say nothing. The tension between them had been building for months. Maria would purposely spill drinks or knock over a vase, hoping for an out, but Alejandro didn't seem bothered. He was always there, watching her with that piercing gaze that felt like it could see through her every move. She hated him. The way he walked through the house like he owned it all. The way his presence was enough to make the entire room go silent. The way everyone feared him, yet he seemed so uninterested in firing her. It was maddening. Maria could feel the weight of his eyes on her every time she passed him in the hallway, his gaze following her, silent, but full of something she couldn't place. She tried to avoid him as much as possible, but he was always there, always watching. One evening, after another failed attempt at making a mistake that would finally get her out of his sight, she found herself standing in front of him once again. Alejandro, with his dark suit and intimidating presence, was sitting at the grand dining table, as always. Maria had just finished cleaning the kitchen, her mind focused on the thought of escaping from this life. But tonight was different. Tonight, Alejandro stood up and walked toward her. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She tried to remain calm, her usual mask of indifference slipping into place. But inside, her thoughts were racing. Was this finally it? Was he going to fire her? He stood before her, tall and imposing, and for the first time, she couldn't look away. His eyes were intense, calculating, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped around them. "You've been trying to get fired, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying a weight that sent shivers down her spine. Maria opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came out. She was caught. He knew. Alejandro took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You thought you could get rid of me by being careless, by making mistakes. But I see through you, Maria. I always have." His voice was cold, but there was something else in it, something that made her chest tighten. Fear? Was it fear she felt, or something else? Maria took a step back, but Alejandro reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip firm, but not painful. "You can't escape, Maria. You're already mine. And now, you will be my wife." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room spun around her, and for a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. Was this really happening? Had she really just heard what she thought she heard? She pulled her wrist from his grasp, but he didn't let go. "What do you mean?" she whispered, barely able to make the words come out. Alejandro's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You've been running from me, from this life, but you belong here. With me. And now, you will stay." Maria felt trapped. There was no escape. She had no choice but to listen. And as much as she hated the idea, something inside her couldn't deny the truth of his words. She had been trying to get away from him for so long, but in the end, it was clear that she never really wanted to leave. Alejandro was right. She belonged to him. The days following that night were a blur for Maria. She had tried so hard to escape her fate, but now she found herself unable to do so. Alejandro's words echoed in her mind constantly. "You are already mine." She could feel his presence everywhere. No matter how hard she tried to focus on her daily chores, his gaze seemed to follow her. She could never escape the weight of it. Her movements were calculated, yet awkward, as if she was still adjusting to the new dynamic in their relationship. Despite her efforts to hide her feelings, it was becoming clear that Maria wasn't the same person she was before. She was no longer just the maid. She was something more. But what exactly? She didn't know. All she knew was that this situation was not what she had planned. It wasn't supposed to go like this. She was supposed to be fired, to be free. But instead, Alejandro had drawn her into his world, a world where power and control were everything. The mansion she worked in, once a place of disdain and escape attempts, now felt suffocating. Every room she walked into, every glance she received from Alejandro or his men, carried the heavy weight of his ownership. It wasn't just her job she had to worry about anymore. It was her entire life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Maria did everything she could to keep her distance from Alejandro, but he made it impossible. Whenever he was near, she could feel the tension in the air, like an electric current. She couldn't help but notice how others treated her now. They were no longer just servants. They were extensions of him. And she had become something entirely different. One day, as she was cleaning the main hallway, Alejandro appeared at the far end of the corridor. He was walking toward her with the same confident, imposing stride that made everyone clear the way for him. His tailored suit, his sharp jawline, his eyes that seemed to see through everything. He was power incarnate. As he reached her, she instinctively stood up straighter, her heart racing. "Maria," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone that made her shiver. "I need you to meet me in my office at 7 tonight. We have a lot to discuss." She nodded, barely able to speak, and quickly moved past him. Her mind was racing. What could he possibly want from her now? She had tried to keep her distance, to be just the maid, but clearly, that wasn't enough. She had been drawn into a world she wasn't prepared for, and there was no way out. That evening, as the clock struck 7, Maria walked toward Alejandro's office. She hesitated for a moment before knocking softly on the door. A deep voice responded from the other side. "Come in." She opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Alejandro was sitting behind a large, polished desk, his fingers steepled together in front of him as he regarded her with those intense, dark eyes. His gaze seemed to weigh her every move, every breath. "Sit down, Maria," he instructed, his tone not a request, but an order. She sat across from him, her back straight, her heart pounding in her chest. "You've been working here for a long time, and I've been watching you," he began, his voice smooth and unwavering. "You're a smart woman, but you've been trying to hide something from me. I want to know why." Maria swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had no idea what he meant. She had been trying so hard to push him away, to make him see that she wasn't interested in his world. But now, here he was, confronting her in a way that made it clear he saw through everything. She opened her mouth to speak, but Alejandro raised a hand to stop her. "I know what you've been doing, Maria. You've been trying to get fired. But I'm not going to let that happen." She stared at him in disbelief. "You're mine now, and you're going to stay here, with me. No more running, no more games." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. What was he saying? Was she truly trapped now? She had wanted to escape, but now it seemed like there was no way out. Alejandro leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he continued. "I'm giving you a choice. You can stay here, in this world, by my side, or you can leave. But if you leave, I'll make sure no one will ever give you a second chance." He paused for a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. "Do you understand?" Maria didn't know how to respond. She was caught between fear and a strange sense of curiosity. Was this what she wanted? Was this the life she was meant to lead? Alejandro stood up and walked toward her, his presence overwhelming. "You belong to me now, Maria, and you will learn to accept that." He reached out, gently placing his hand on hers, his touch surprisingly warm and gentle. For a moment, she almost forgot where she was, what this meant. But then reality crashed back in. She was trapped, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Maria had never felt more trapped in her life. What had she gotten herself into? After that night in Alejandro's office, everything had changed. She could no longer pretend that her actions had no consequences. She was in too deep now, and there was no way out. Alejandro's words haunted her mind. "You belong to me now." He had made it clear that there was no going back, that she had been drawn into his world, whether she liked it or not. The next few weeks were difficult for Maria. She tried her best to keep her distance from him, to maintain the facade of indifference, but it was impossible. Alejandro's presence was everywhere. He was always watching her, observing her every move, like a hawk waiting to strike. He seemed to be everywhere in the mansion, his sharp eyes following her every step. And no matter what she did, He always found a way to draw her into his orbit. It wasn't just her job anymore. She was part of his world now, whether she wanted to be or not. Every day, Maria woke up to the same routine: cleaning, organizing, serving. But now, it all felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And she couldn't help but wonder if Alejandro was keeping her close for a reason. Was it just about power? Or was there something more? One evening, as she was cleaning the large dining hall, Alejandro appeared at the far end of the room. He was alone this time. No bodyguards, no security. Just him. He was wearing a tailored black suit, his dark hair neatly styled, his eyes as piercing as ever. He walked toward her with that confident stride that made everyone around him step aside. As he approached, Maria felt a rush of nervous energy flood her body. She tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. His presence had a way of making her feel both small and important at the same time. When he reached her, he didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, staring at her, those dark eyes filled with something she couldn't read. Maria felt herself growing uncomfortable under his gaze. "Maria," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable authority behind it. "You've been avoiding me." She froze, unsure of how to respond. Was it really avoiding him, or just trying to keep some sense of distance? "I haven't been avoiding you," she said softly, trying to sound casual. Alejandro raised an eyebrow. "Don't lie to me." His words cut through the air like a knife. Maria's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly looked down, avoiding his gaze. "I'm not lying," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Alejandro stepped closer, his scent filling the air around them. The perfume he wore was subtle but rich, an expensive fragrance that only someone with wealth and power could afford. "I see through you, Maria," he said, his voice low and measured. "You can try to play games, but I'm not one to be deceived." Maria's throat tightened as she tried to form a response, but her mind was blank. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say to him anymore. Every word she spoke felt like a trap, a mistake waiting to happen. Alejandro's hand reached out and gently touched her arm, his fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. "You think you can fool me, but you can't," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been trying to get fired, trying to get away from me, but I won't let that happen." Maria's breath hitched in her chest. "I didn't," she began, but Alejandro cut her off. "I know what you've been doing. I've been watching you, Maria. And I know that deep down, you're not as innocent as you pretend to be." Maria felt a flush of embarrassment rising in her cheeks. She had been so careful, so determined to distance herself from him. But now, in the face of his words, everything seemed pointless. She couldn't escape. She wasn't the person she thought she was. Alejandro smiled slightly, as if he could sense her inner turmoil. "You're mine, Maria," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "And now, you're going to accept it." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Maria could feel her resolve crumbling. She had tried to run, to escape, but now, it was clear that there was no way out. Alejandro had already claimed her, and whether she liked it or not, she was bound to him. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. "I don't want this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't matter," Alejandro replied, his hand still resting on her arm. "You don't get to choose anymore. You're mine now." Maria's mind raced, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized he was right. She had been caught in his web, and there was no escape. She was his, whether she accepted it or not. And deep down, a small part of her realized that maybe, just maybe, she had always known this was coming. The days after that confrontation in Alejandro's office felt like they were dragging on for Maria. She couldn't shake the feeling of being under his control, trapped in his world. The mansion, which once felt like a prison, now felt like a gilded cage. Every morning she woke up with a sinking feeling in her stomach, knowing that another day under his watch was ahead. She could feel his presence in every corner of the house. Alejandro was always watching, always knowing what she was doing, always observing her with those calculating eyes. Maria had hoped that if she kept her distance, things would go back to normal, but she was wrong. Alejandro had made it clear that she was now part of his world, and no matter how hard she tried to fight it, she couldn't escape. Every task she did, from cleaning the grand dining hall to running errands for him, felt like an obligation she could no longer avoid. The more time passed, the more she realized just how much power he held over her. It was more than just her job, it was her entire life now. Alejandro had made sure of that. One evening, after a particularly long day, Maria was heading to the kitchen to get something to eat when she unexpectedly ran into him. He was standing in the hallway, leaning casually against the wall, his arms crossed, his usual cold gaze fixed on her. Maria froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been avoiding him for days, but now here he was, standing right in front of her. "Maria," he said, his voice smooth and deep. "We need to talk." The way he said it left no room for argument. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Maria swallowed, trying to calm her nerves. She nodded, unable to find the words. Alejandro pushed himself off the wall and began walking toward her. "Come with me," he instructed. He didn't wait for her to respond, but instead led her toward the grand living room. Maria followed reluctantly, her mind racing. What could he want now? She had tried so hard to keep her distance, to keep things as professional as possible, but he kept pulling her back into his world. Once they reached the living room, Alejandro gestured for her to sit. "I've been thinking, Maria," he began, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of finality. "You're still resisting, aren't you?" Maria looked down at her hands, not trusting herself to speak. It wasn't that she was resisting, she just felt trapped. Everything she had done so far had only brought her deeper into his world. "I told you once," Alejandro continued, "that you belong to me. But you still act like you're free. You're not, Maria. And you need to understand that." Maria's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. What was there left to say? She had tried to fight him, but he had already won. She was in his world now. Alejandro paced in front of her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You think I don't know that you've been trying to push me away? But it's pointless. You'll never be free of me." His words sent a chill down her spine, but there was no denying the truth in them. She had tried so hard to run, to escape, but now, she realized that there was no way out. Alejandro stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "I want you to understand something, Maria," he said, his tone soft but heavy with authority. "You're mine, and no matter how much you fight it, you will stay with me." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Maria felt the full weight of her situation. She couldn't deny it anymore. She was trapped. She had been trying to escape, but in the end, there was nowhere to go. Alejandro had made sure of that. She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and frustration. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Alejandro's expression softened, but only slightly. "Because you're mine," he repeated, as if the answer should have been obvious. "And whether you like it or not, that's not going to change." Maria opened her mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. What could she say? Alejandro was right. She had tried everything to get away, but it hadn't worked. She was still here, still under his control. She didn't know what to do anymore. "You're going to stay here with me, Maria," Alejandro said, his voice firm. "And you will learn to accept it. This is your life now." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Maria felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She couldn't fight him. She had already lost. Alejandro was right. She was his. And now, there was no going back. Maria felt like a prisoner in her own life now. Every day seemed to drag on longer than the last. Alejandro's words echoed in her mind constantly, replaying over and over, "You're mine now." It was a mantra that haunted her thoughts, a constant reminder of how helpless she was in the face of his power. The mansion had become her cage, the place she had once resented now becoming the only place she knew. Every room, every corner of it, felt like it was closing in on her. It had been weeks since that night in Alejandro's office, and nothing had changed. No matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to escape, he was always there, watching. He had made it clear that she could never leave. The feeling of being under his control weighed on her like an anchor. She had tried everything, avoiding him, keeping her distance, doing her best to make mistakes. But nothing worked. Alejandro had seen through every move she made. Every time she thought she might get fired, every time she thought he would give her the freedom she so desperately wanted, he simply stood there, that cold, calculating gaze never wavering. It was maddening. And now, she was stuck. Stuck in a life she never asked for, stuck in a world she didn't understand, and yet, there was no way out. One evening as She cleaned the grand hallway. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Maria turned, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Alejandro standing there. He was alone, his tall figure filling the hallway as he looked at her with those piercing eyes. "Maria," he said, his voice calm, but his tone carried a certain authority. "I need to talk to you." She froze. She didn't know if she was ready for another one of their conversations, another moment where she had no control. Alejandro walked toward her slowly, his steps deliberate. He had that same presence, that air of control that made her feel small, insignificant. He was the embodiment of power, and she was the one who had to bow to it. "I've been thinking," he said, stopping just a few feet away from her. "You've been trying to get away from me for so long, haven't you?" Maria's stomach turned. She didn't know how to respond. She had been trying to get away, to escape this life, but now, it felt pointless to say anything. She couldn't fight him. She had already lost. Alejandro's eyes softened, but only slightly. He was still the same man who held all the cards. "You think you can fight me," he continued, "but you can't. You're mine, Maria, and you'll learn to accept it." Maria swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She had never wanted this. She had never asked for any of this. But now, it was clear that she didn't have a choice. Alejandro reached out and placed his hand gently on her arm, his fingers warm against her skin. The touch was strangely comforting, but also unsettling. It reminded her of just how much power he had over her. "I won't let you go," he said, his voice low. "You belong here with me." Maria wanted to pull away, to run, but something held her back. It was as if his words had sunk deep into her, rooting her to the spot. She was trapped, and there was no escaping it. Alejandro's grip tightened slightly, but it wasn't painful. It was just enough to remind her that she was his, that she would always be his. "You're going to learn to live with it," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're going to learn to love this life, Maria. And I will make sure of it." Maria's mind was racing. She didn't know how much longer she could stand this. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to do anything to free herself from his hold. But the truth was, she didn't know how. She didn't know if she even had the strength to fight anymore. Alejandro took a step closer, his body almost touching hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the power emanating from his every movement. He was so close that it felt like he was suffocating her. "You don't have to like it," he said, "but you will learn to accept it." Maria looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. What was he going to do to her now? What else could he take from her? "I've already taken everything from you," Alejandro whispered, his voice barely audible. "And now, you'll learn to accept that. You will be my wife, Maria, and that's the life you will lead from now on." The words hit her like a ton of bricks. She wanted to argue, to scream, to fight back, but there was nothing left inside her. She had already lost. She was already his. And deep down, a part of her knew that she would never be free again. She had become a part of his world, whether she liked it or not. There was no going back. And as Alejandro's hand brushed against her cheek, Maria realized that this was it. This was her life now, for better or for worse. And there was nothing she could do to change it. Maria's life had taken a turn she hadn't seen coming. Despite all her efforts to break free, to make a way out for herself, Alejandro had always seen through her. Every time she tried to create distance, he would only pull her back in, more forcefully than before. He had made it clear, she was his now, and there was no escape. And so, the days dragged on, each one blurring into the next. Maria woke every morning to the same routine. The cleaning, the serving, the constant tension of living in a mansion where everyone knew their place. And hers was at Alejandro's side, whether she liked it or not. She had to admit it. She couldn't avoid him anymore. He was always there, always watching. It wasn't just the power he held over her. It was the way he seemed to understand her better than anyone else. He saw past her attempts to push him away, to the real emotions beneath. She had tried to hate him, to resist him, but now it was becoming clear. Alejandro wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man who had claimed her, and she could do nothing about it. That night, after another exhausting day of serving guests at one of his high-profile parties, Maria found herself in her room, staring out the window. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the floor. She longed for a life beyond these walls, a life where she didn't have to constantly look over her shoulder, where she could be free. But as much as she tried to wish it all away, she knew deep down it wasn't going to happen. Alejandro had drawn her into his world, and now she was stuck. Suddenly, the door to her room creaked open. Maria turned around to find Alejandro standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Maria," he said, his voice low and calm, yet it carried a weight that made her stomach churn. "We need to talk." She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She had no energy left to fight him. She had no more arguments, no more excuses. Alejandro stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. "I've been watching you," he said, his tone almost thoughtful. "You've been trying to avoid me, but I see right through you." Maria stood there, her heart racing. She didn't know how to respond. She had been trying to avoid him, hadn't she? She had tried to keep her distance, to ignore the growing attraction that she felt against her will. But how could she when he was always there, pulling her in? Alejandro moved closer to her, his presence overwhelming. "You think you can just disappear into the background," he continued, his voice growing colder. "But you can't. Not anymore. You belong to me." Maria's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. She tried to find her voice, to say something, anything that could change the situation, but it felt as though the words were trapped in her throat. "I don't belong to you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Alejandro's eyes darkened, his expression hardening. He took another step toward her, his hand reaching out to gently cup her cheek. The touch was soft, but there was a sense of finality to it. "You don't get to decide anymore," he said. "I've already decided for you. You are mine, Maria, and you'll learn to accept it." She wanted to pull away, to scream, to do something to stop him, but she didn't. She was too exhausted, too beaten down by the weight of everything. Alejandro tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You don't have to love me," he said, "but you will respect me. You will live in my world, by my rules." Maria felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly, not wanting to show any sign of weakness. But Alejandro didn't seem to care. He saw it all, the anger, the frustration, the fear. He saw her completely, and it made her feel exposed in a way she never had before. He moved closer, his breath warm against her skin. "This is your life now, Maria," he whispered. "You can fight it all you want, but in the end, you will learn to live with it." Maria closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find a way to escape, but there was no escape. No escape from the man who had claimed her, no escape from the world he had created around her. She had been so determined to break free, but now it felt like there was no way out. And deep down, she knew he was right. She was his. She had been for a long time. "I'm not asking for your love," Alejandro said, his voice softening for the first time. "I'm asking for your trust. I will protect you, Maria, in ways you can't even imagine. You will learn to see that. You will see how much power I have to give you." He pulled away slightly, his hand still resting on her cheek. Maria could feel the heat of his touch, the power behind it. She felt small, insignificant, caught in the web he had woven around her. "You don't have to love me," he repeated, "but you will learn to respect me. And soon, you will understand why you belong with me." Maria stared up at him, her chest tight, her emotions in turmoil. She had no choice but to accept it, didn't she? No choice but to live in this gilded cage, with Alejandro as the key holder. She had lost the fight. She was trapped in his world, and there was nothing she could do to change that. The days following that evening felt like they dragged on endlessly for Maria. Alejandro had made it clear that her life was no longer hers to control. He had asserted his dominance over her, and she felt powerless to change it. Every step she took in the mansion, every glance she received from him, reminded her that she was no longer just a maid. She was something more to him, and she hated it. She hated feeling trapped in his world, hated the way his presence loomed over her, making her feel small and insignificant. But no matter how much she resisted, there was no way out. Alejandro had claimed her, and there was no escaping the web he had woven around her. The mansion that once felt like a prison was now her reality. Every morning she woke up to the same routine, cleaning, serving, living under the watchful eyes of Alejandro and his men. The distance she had tried so hard to maintain between them had vanished. There was no avoiding him, no escaping him. As much as she tried to avoid the truth, it became clearer with each passing day. She belonged to him. Alejandro's power and control were inescapable. He had slowly begun to change the way the staff looked at her, how they treated her. No longer was she just the maid. She was under Alejandro's protection now, and that came with a different kind of power. People no longer spoke to her in the same way. They respected her in a way that made her uncomfortable. But she didn't want their respect. She didn't want anything from them. She wanted out. And yet, every time she thought about leaving, her thoughts were clouded by Alejandro's last words. "You're mine now." He had made that clear, and there was no way to undo it. One night, as she was cleaning the grand dining room, Alejandro entered, as always, with his commanding presence. His sharp suit, his confident stride, everything about him screamed authority. He was impossible to ignore. Maria looked up as he approached her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Maria," he said, his voice calm but full of authority. "I need you to come with me." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had no choice but to obey. She followed him down the hall, her mind racing. What did he want from her now? As they reached his study, Alejandro turned to her. "You've been distant," he said, his voice colder than usual. "I need to know why." Maria swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. What could she say? "I don't want this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alejandro took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "What don't you want, Maria? This life? Or me?" His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She couldn't bring herself to answer. "You can't keep resisting me," he continued, his voice low but firm. "I've already made my decision. You're mine, and you will learn to accept it." Maria felt a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over her. She had tried to fight him, but she knew deep down that it was pointless. Alejandro had already won. She was trapped in his world, and there was no escaping it. He reached out and gently cupped her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "I've given you everything you need," he said, his voice softer now. "You will learn to appreciate what I've done for you. You will learn to see that you belong with me." Maria could feel his thumb brushing against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. There was something about the way he spoke to her that made her feel both comforted and uneasy. She had always resented him, but now, she wasn't so sure. Was it possible she had begun to depend on him in some way? "I don't want to be here," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to leave." Alejandro's gaze hardened. "You don't get to leave, Maria," he said, his voice cold again. "You're mine, and you'll stay with me. You will learn to love this life, whether you want to or not." Maria's chest tightened as she fought to hold back tears. She hated the way he was manipulating her, forcing her into a life she didn't choose. But there was no escape. She was bound to him, and she had no idea how to free herself. Alejandro pulled her into him, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes dark and intense. "You belong with me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "and you will learn to accept it." Maria felt her heart race as she tried to break free, but his grip was firm. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. And for the first time in weeks, she realized that maybe she didn't want to. There was a part of her that had always been drawn to him, no matter how much she tried to deny it. She had been running from him for so long, but now, in his arms, she felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't love, she knew that, but it was something else, something darker. "You will stay with me," Alejandro repeated, his voice soft but filled with finality. "And you will learn to love this life. You will learn to love me." Maria closed her eyes, her heart heavy with confusion. She had no choice but to accept this life now. She had been forced into it, and as much as she wanted to fight it, she knew deep down that she would never escape. She was his, and there was nothing she could do to change that. The weeks following that night had changed Maria in ways she couldn't explain. Her life had turned into a series of calculated moves, always under Alejandro's watchful eye. The mansion that had once felt like a prison now seemed even more like one. She went through her days mechanically, her movements cold and deliberate. Alejandro's presence haunted her every corner, his eyes always watching, always observing. She had tried to deny it, tried to ignore the strange connection that had begun to form between them, but now, it was undeniable. The more she tried to resist, the more she felt drawn to him. Despite herself, she couldn't help but think about him in a way that she didn't want to. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something else. She hated that part of herself. She hated the way she felt when he was near, the The way his commanding voice seemed to echo in her mind long after their conversations ended. Maria had hoped that her anger and resistance would be enough to push him away. But it was clear now, it wasn't. Alejandro wasn't just a mafia boss, he was a force of nature, a man who made the world bend to his will, and Maria was no exception. One night, as the evening stretched on and the mansion was filled with the usual chaos of staff rushing to prepare for a large event, Maria found herself alone in the kitchen. She had been washing dishes, her mind miles away, trying to focus on anything other than the constant pressure of Alejandro's presence. But as always, the moment she thought she could have some peace, he appeared. Alejandro stood in the doorway, watching her with that intense gaze that always made her feel like she was being read like an open book. She paused, her heart skipping a beat, and set down the plate she was holding. "Maria," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness of the kitchen. "I need to talk to you." Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't unusual for him to call her to his office or to give her orders, but there was something different about tonight. Something in the way he looked at her made her feel like everything was about to change again. Alejandro stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his dark eyes never leaving hers. Maria could feel her pulse racing as he approached. It wasn't fear exactly, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Something had shifted, and she didn't know what it was. He reached out and lightly touched her arm, his hand warm against her skin. "You've been distant," he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "I don't like that, Maria." She tried to pull away from his touch, but his grip tightened, not painfully, but enough to remind her that she was under his control. "I've been busy," she replied, her voice a little shaky. It was a lie, and they both knew it. "You think I don't see what's been happening?" Alejandro's voice grew low and intense. "You've been trying to push me away, trying to get under my skin. But you can't, Maria." Her heart raced, but she stood still, staring up at him. It was clear now, there was no hiding from him. He knew everything. "I haven't been trying to get away from you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know how to finish. How could she explain the feelings swirling inside her? How could she admit that part of her didn't want to push him away, even though she knew she should? Alejandro leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You don't have to pretend with me," he whispered. "I see right through you." The words sent a chill down Maria's spine, but at the same time, something inside her seemed to wake up. She hated the way he made her feel, so exposed, so vulnerable. "You're mine now, Maria," he said softly, almost tenderly. "You'll learn to accept that." Maria shook her head slightly, the words he spoke cutting deeper than she cared to admit. She had fought so hard to keep her distance, to hold on to whatever semblance of control she had left, but now, it felt like that control was slipping away, and she didn't know how to stop it. "I don't want to be yours," she said, barely managing to get the words out. Alejandro smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile that made her heart sink, a smile that made her feel like she was already lost. "It's not about what you want, Maria," he said. "It's about what's already happening. You belong to me now, and you will learn to accept it." He moved closer again, his hands gently cupping her face, forcing her to look into his eyes. "You don't have to love me," he said, his voice quieter now, softer. "But you will respect me, and in time, you will learn to see that I'm the best thing that ever happened to you." His words lingered in the air, and Maria felt a mix of emotions rise within her. Part of her wanted to argue, to scream, to fight back. But another part of her, a part she didn't want to admit, was listening to his words. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel the safety that came with his protection, but at what cost? "You will learn to love this life," Alejandro continued, his voice gentle, almost persuasive. "You will see that with me, you're stronger than you've ever been." Maria felt a tear slip down her cheek, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself feel the weight of it all. She was trapped, and she didn't know how to escape. Alejandro was right. She had no choice but to accept it. She was his, and she would have to learn to live with it, whether she liked it or not. The weeks that followed felt like a blur to Maria. Every day, she woke up in the same grand mansion, surrounded by luxury, yet feeling more like a prisoner than ever before. Alejandro's words still echoed in her mind. "You belong to me now." There was no escaping him, no hiding from the reality that he had taken control of her life. Despite everything she tried, She couldn't fight him anymore. Maria found herself doing the same things every day. Cleaning, serving, living under Alejandro's watchful eye. The power dynamic had shifted, and she was no longer the maid she had once been. She was something more to him, something he controlled. Alejandro had given her no choice but to accept it. She had once hoped she could push him away, but now it felt as though that hope was long gone. It wasn't just the job that had changed, her entire world had. Alejandro was always there, whether in passing or in her thoughts, his presence never far. The connection between them, a strange mix of tension and attraction, had become undeniable. Maria hated it. She hated the fact that a part of her had started to depend on him. It made her feel weak, and she refused to admit it. But despite all her efforts to resist, there was something in her that couldn't ignore him, that couldn't walk away from the strange hold he had over her. One evening, as Maria was preparing the kitchen for a late-night meal, Alejandro appeared once again. This time, he didn't say anything right away. He just stood in the doorway, watching her with those piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. Maria couldn't help but feel that familiar knot in her stomach, the one she'd tried to ignore for so long. "Maria," he said after a long silence. His voice was steady, authoritative, the same way it always was. "We need to talk." She set the knife down, wiping her hands on her apron as she turned to face him. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She had no idea what he wanted now, but she already knew. There was no escaping him. There never had been. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Alejandro took a step toward her, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to stop pretending, Maria," he said, his tone calm, but full of an undeniable power. "Stop pretending that you don't feel what's happening between us." His words hit her like a shockwave, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. He was right. She had been pretending, lying to herself, telling herself she didn't feel the pull toward him. But now, it was impossible to deny. "I don't want this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it louder might make it true. Alejandro's lips curled into a small smile, one that was more knowing than kind. "It doesn't matter what you want, Maria," he said softly. "You are mine, whether you accept it or not." His words sent a chill down her spine, but she stood her ground. "I won't let you control me," she said, though the doubt in her voice betrayed her. Alejandro stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You already belong to me," he said, his voice low and calm, "and you will learn to live with it." Maria wanted to say something, to protest, to fight back, but she couldn't. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a blur. What was the point of fighting anymore? Everything she had done to resist him had only drawn her deeper into his world. She had no choice but to face the truth. She was trapped. Alejandro moved even closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, the heat of his body, so close it was almost suffocating. "I know you've been trying to push me away," he said quietly. "But I see through you, Maria. I know what you need." His hand reached up, gently brushing a lock of hair from her face. She wanted to pull away, to push him back, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen, caught between anger and something else, something she didn't want to admit. Alejandro's fingers traced along her cheek, and for a moment, Maria allowed herself to feel the warmth of his touch. She hated herself for it. "You don't have to love me," Alejandro said, his voice soft but filled with an undeniable authority. "But you will respect me, and in time, you will see that this life, our life, is the only one you need." Maria's heart raced as he leaned in closer. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. She should have resisted. She should have pushed him away. But she didn't. She stood there, caught in his gaze, unable to move. Alejandro's lips brushed against her ear, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're mine, Maria, and I will make you understand that." The words sank into her, deep into her soul, and she couldn't deny the truth of them. She was his, and there was no turning back. The weeks that followed felt like an endless loop for Maria. She could no longer distinguish between the days. Each one seemed to blur into the next, all of them filled with the same mundane routine. Cleaning, serving, avoiding Alejandro's gaze. But it was impossible to ignore him. His presence was always there, looming over her every moment. Maria had hoped that over time, she would grow numb to it all, that the weight of his power would eventually fade. But it hadn't. If anything, it only seemed to grow stronger. Alejandro had made her his, and there was no escaping that fact. Every night, when the mansion fell silent, she would lie in her bed, her thoughts racing. She had never asked for this. She never imagined that her life would end up like this, controlled by a man whose world she didn't understand. And yet, there she was, trapped in the web of his influence. She had tried to run, tried to find an escape, but the truth was clear. There was no way out. Alejandro had made it clear from the start. She belonged to him. And whether she liked it or not, she would learn to accept that. One evening, as she was walking down the hallway, trying to avoid yet another awkward encounter with Alejandro, he appeared before her. She froze. He was standing at the end of the hall, waiting, his dark eyes locked onto hers, and she felt that familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She wanted to turn and walk away, but she couldn't. He was like a force of nature, pulling her in every time. "Maria," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Maria hesitated for a moment before walking toward him, her feet heavy as though they were dragging her toward him against her will. When she reached him, he didn't say anything right away. He simply studied her, as if he were trying to see inside her, as if he could read every thought in her mind. Maria couldn't look away, even though every part of her wanted to. "What is it?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I want you to stop fighting this," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Stop pretending you don't belong here." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was saying, and the truth of it cut deeper than she expected. She had tried so hard to convince herself that she didn't want this, that she didn't want to be with him. But deep down, a part of her knew he was right. She did belong here now. She had no choice. Alejandro took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she felt the warmth of his touch. For a moment, she felt something stir within her, a strange mix of fear and something else. She wanted to pull away, to resist, but she couldn't. His hand was soft against her skin, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. "You don't have to love me, Maria," he said, his voice low and sincere. "But you do need to accept that you belong with me." Maria shook her head slightly, the words getting caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond. Was she supposed to admit that part of her had already accepted it? That part of her was starting to see the truth of what Alejandro was saying, but that truth terrified her. "I don't know how to do that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alejandro smiled, his thumb gently brushing across her cheek. "I'll help you," he said softly. "You'll see that this life, our life, is the only one you need." Maria swallowed hard, the words catching in her chest. She wanted to fight him, wanted to push him away, but there was no denying the fact that she was drawn to him in a way she didn't understand. She had fought so hard to stay away, to maintain some shred of control, but now it felt like that control was slipping away. Alejandro stepped back slightly, giving her space, but his eyes never left hers. "I've already given you everything you need," he said, his voice steady. "And in time, you'll realize that this is the life you were meant for. You'll learn to trust me, to let go of everything you thought you knew." Maria opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. What could she say? What could she do to fight against this force that had taken over her life? She had no answers. She was powerless against him. "I'm not going to force you," Alejandro continued, his voice softening. "But I want you to understand that you're mine, and you will stay with me." The finality in his words sent a chill down her spine, but at the same time, there was something else in them, something that made her feel as though she had no choice but to accept it. Maria stood there, frozen, her mind racing. She had wanted to break free, wanted to run away from him, but the truth was clear. She was already his, and there was no going back now. Alejandro had already made sure of that. The life she once knew was gone. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was bound to him, and there was no way to escape. As days turned into weeks, Maria felt herself sinking deeper into a world she never wanted to be a part of. Despite the way she resisted, despite the constant internal battle, the reality was undeniable. She was tied to Alejandro. She had tried so hard to push him away, but every time she thought she could escape, he was there, reminding her that she was his. The mansion that once felt like a distant prison now felt like her only reality. The walls closed in, and with each passing day, the freedom she once dreamed of seemed more like a fantasy. Alejandro's presence in her life was inescapable, and though she had tried to ignore it, a small part of her was starting to accept the truth. She was not just the maid anymore. She was his, and there was no way out. One evening, Maria was walking through the mansion's grand hall, carrying fresh linens to one of the guest rooms, when she saw Alejandro at the far end of the corridor. As always, his figure commanded the space around him, tall, confident, and imposing. The air seemed to shift as soon as their eyes met. For a moment, Maria froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wanted to look away, to keep walking, to pretend she didn't feel that undeniable pull toward him. But she couldn't. His gaze held her captive. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there, watching her, his eyes never leaving hers. Maria felt the weight of his stare pressing against her chest. She had no choice but to walk toward him, every step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached him, Alejandro didn't waste any time. "Maria," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "We need to talk." She swallowed, her throat dry, unsure of what he wanted from her now. It felt like every conversation with him led her down a path she didn't want to follow. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep the tension out of her voice. Alejandro stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I know you're still trying to push me away," he said, his tone low, almost too calm. "But you need to stop pretending." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. The way he spoke to her, with that knowing, calculating tone, made her feel exposed, as if there was nothing left for her to hide. She had tried so hard to pretend she wasn't drawn to him, that she didn't feel the strange connection that seemed to grow stronger every day, but it was impossible. Alejandro reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek in a gesture that was almost tender. "You can't keep fighting this," he said softly. "I've already decided, Maria. You belong with me." His words hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. She felt everything she had tried to hold back, all the emotions she had been burying, flood to the surface. She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't want this, but she didn't have the strength to do so. The truth was, she couldn't deny it any longer. She belonged to him. "You don't have to love me," Alejandro continued, his voice softer now, as if he was coaxing her into understanding. "But you will respect me, and in time, you will see that what I'm offering you is more than anything you've ever had." Maria felt tears well up in her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. She hated herself for feeling so vulnerable, so powerless in front of him. She had spent so long trying to avoid this, trying to fight against the inevitable, but here she was, caught in the web of his control. Alejandro stepped closer again, his body now just inches away from hers. His gaze never wavered, his eyes locked on hers, as if he could see into her very soul. "You belong with me, Maria," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And you'll learn to accept that." Maria's chest tightened, and for a moment, she thought she might suffocate from the weight of his words. She had no choice. He had already made that clear. The life she had once imagined for herself, the life of freedom and independence, was slipping through her fingers. She was trapped in his world, and there was no way out. Alejandro's hand gently cupped her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I know this is hard for you," he said softly, "but I'm not asking for your love. I'm asking for your trust. I will give you everything you need, everything you've ever wanted, but you have to trust me." Maria didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if she could trust him, but part of her was beginning to believe that there was no choice but to accept it. She could keep fighting, keep pretending, but in the end, she knew she would only lose. Alejandro had already won. He had taken control of her life, and there was nothing she could do to change that. "You will learn to love this life," Alejandro said, his voice steady. "And soon, you'll see that you belong with me." Maria felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. There was no hiding the truth anymore. She had become part of his world. She was his, and there was no turning back now. Days turned into weeks, and Maria could feel herself losing control. The more she resisted, the tighter Alejandro's grip on her life became. She had hoped, so desperately, that one day he would simply let her go, that he would get tired of the constant push and pull. But with each passing moment, it became clearer that he had no intention of releasing her. She was his, and she would remain his. The mansion had become her prison, a gilded cage she could not escape. She hated the feeling of being trapped, but there was nothing she could do. Her attempts to push Alejandro away had only drawn him closer. He had seen through her plan, and now, there was no way to turn back. Every corner of the mansion reminded her that she belonged to him. It was a life she never chose, but one she had been thrust into. She had no choice but to accept it, as much as it tortured her. Her thoughts were consumed by Alejandro. His eyes, his voice, the way his presence made her feel both small and, in a strange way, powerful. She had never wanted this connection, never wanted to be drawn to him, but no matter how much she tried to fight it, she couldn't help herself. Alejandro was always watching, always controlling, always there. And despite herself, Maria was beginning to realize that she might be starting to depend on him. It sickened her. One afternoon, as she was finishing up her duties, Maria was summoned to Alejandro's office. The familiar weight of dread settled in her chest. She had hoped that things might be different, that maybe she could keep some distance from him, but deep down, she knew better. The moment she entered his office, he was waiting for her, sitting behind his grand desk, looking as powerful as ever. The air felt thick with tension. "Maria," Alejandro said, his voice calm, but with an edge that made her skin prickle. "You've been avoiding me again." Maria froze. She had no idea how to respond. She had tried so hard to keep her distance, to avoid the inevitable pull he had on her, but it was impossible. "I'm not avoiding you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "Don't lie to me," he replied, his tone turning cold. "I see right through you." Maria's heart skipped a beat. He always saw through her, didn't he? It was infuriating, yet there was a strange comfort in it as well. She knew that no matter how hard she tried, Alejandro would always have the upper hand. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a look that made her feel exposed. "You don't have to fight me," he said softly, his voice almost sympathetic. "I've already made you mine. I've already decided your place in my world." Maria felt her chest tighten. She hated that feeling of being completely at his mercy, of having no control over her own life. But what could she do? She was already trapped, already caught in the web of his power. Alejandro stood up, walking around his desk until he was standing in front of her. His proximity made her heart race, and she couldn't stop the nerves from taking over. "You don't get to leave, Maria," he continued, his voice low and steady. "You're mine, and you will stay with me." Maria wanted to argue, wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she didn't want this life, but the words stuck in her throat. What was the point? He wouldn't listen, and deep down, she knew it. Alejandro reached out and gently cupped her face, forcing her to look up at him. His touch was gentle, but it held so much power. "You belong with me," he said, his voice softening. "And in time, you will come to understand why." Maria shook her head slightly, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. How had she let it come to this? How had she gone from resisting him with every fiber of her being to standing here, trapped in his world? It wasn't supposed to be like this. She hadn't asked for any of it. She hadn't asked to fall into his web, but here she was. And the worst part was that part of her wasn't sure she wanted to escape anymore. "You don't have to love me," Alejandro said, his voice almost coaxing now. "But you will respect me. And in time, you'll see that this life, our life, is the only one you need." The words sank into her, settling in her chest like a heavy weight. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. He was right. She was his. There was no going back. She had tried to fight it, but now it felt like she was simply giving in. The resistance she had once felt was beginning to fade, replaced by something else, a strange, inexplicable feeling of acceptance. And though it terrified her, she knew deep down that she was starting to understand Alejandro's world, his power, and the hold he had on her. He wasn't just a mafia boss. He was the man who had completely altered the course of her life. And there was no turning back now. "You will learn to love this life, Maria," he said, his voice confident. "And you will learn to love me." Maria didn't respond. She couldn't. She was already lost in his world, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be found. Alejandro had claimed her, and now, she would live in his world, on his terms. There was no escaping it. The weeks had passed, and Maria's life had changed in ways she could never have predicted. Every part of her resistance had crumbled, And now, as much as she hated to admit it, she had accepted the life Alejandro had laid out for her. The mansion, which had once been a prison of her own making, had become a place she now moved through with the resignation of someone who had no choice but to accept their fate. There were no more fights, no more plans to escape. It was as if the fight had gone out of her, and she had finally come to terms with the fact that this was her life now. Alejandro had claimed her, and there was no going back. Each day she lived with the constant reminder of that truth. The walls of the mansion, the grand halls, the rooms she cleaned, all seemed to be a constant reflection of his power. The life she once dreamed of was now an impossible fantasy. She had tried to convince herself she didn't need him, that she could fight the connection between them, but it was useless. He had made her his, and the more she fought it, the more she was pulled into his world. She had tried to avoid him, to distance herself, but Alejandro's power was all-consuming, and every time she thought she could slip away, he was there, watching, controlling, guiding her back to him. It was his world, and she was simply a part of it. One night, as the estate settled into its usual silence, Maria found herself standing by the window in her room, looking out at the sprawling grounds. The night air was cool, and the soft sounds of the night were calming, almost peaceful. But the peace never lasted long. The door to her room creaked open, and Maria turned to find Alejandro standing there. As always, he filled the doorway, his presence large and imposing. His dark eyes were fixed on her, studying her, reading her like an open book. "Maria," he said, his voice low but filled with an intensity that made her heart race. "It's time." She stood frozen, unsure of what he meant. She had learned not to ask too many questions, not to resist him. But still, something inside her stirred at his words. "Time for what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alejandro stepped inside, his presence overwhelming as always. He walked toward her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Time for you to fully accept what you are," he said. "You belong to me. It's time to stop pretending otherwise." Maria's heart clenched at his words. It was a truth she had known for a long time, but hearing him say it so plainly sent a wave of emotion through her. She had fought it, tried to deny it, but it was clear now. She couldn't escape him. "I never asked for this," she said, her voice barely audible. Alejandro smiled, a slow, almost amused smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't have to ask for anything, Maria," he replied. "It's already been decided." His voice softened slightly, and he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You were meant to be mine, and now, you will learn to embrace that." Maria stood still, her breath shallow as she stared at him. There was no fighting it anymore. She had already been claimed by him, body and soul. The reality of her situation hit her like a wave, and she could feel the tears threaten to spill, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough for this life. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "How to live with you like this." Alejandro stepped closer, his face inches from hers. He cupped her cheek gently, his touch warm, almost comforting. "You don't have to know right now," he said. "I'll show you. I'll teach you. In time, you'll learn that everything I do is for you, for us." His words settled deep within her, a part of her wanting to believe him, but another part of her screaming in defiance. She had been trapped in this world for so long now, and she couldn't remember what it felt like to be free. The constant weight of Alejandro's presence was something she had come to expect, but it didn't make it any easier. Still, part of her felt something shifting inside her, something that told her maybe, just maybe, she had a place in this life with him. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something else. Something darker, something she didn't fully understand. "You're mine now," Alejandro whispered, his lips brushing against her ear. "And you will stay with me. You will learn to love this life. You will learn to love me." Maria closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had no choice, not really. Alejandro had claimed her, and there was nothing left to do but accept it. She was his, and maybe, just maybe, she could learn to find a way to live in this world. It wasn't what she had planned. It wasn't what she had hoped for, but it was the only life she had now. And as Alejandro pulled her closer, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all, the weight of his power, his control, and the strange, undeniable pull he had on her. She was his, and there was no turning back now. In this gripping story of dark romance, Maria finds herself trapped in a world she never chose, caught between her desires and her resistance. Alejandro, a powerful mafia boss, claims her as his own, and despite her attempts to break free, Maria discovers that she is drawn deeper into his dark world. With every step she takes, the line between love and control blurs, and she finds herself learning to accept a life where freedom no longer exists. This dark romance explores the themes of power, control, and acceptance in a relationship defined by dominance. As Maria struggles to maintain her autonomy, she slowly realizes that escaping Alejandro is impossible. The more she tries to fight him, the more she is pulled into his world, where love is overshadowed by possessiveness and power. As their relationship deepens, Maria must navigate the complexities of being with a man who sees her as his own, understanding that her life will never be the same again. This dark romance will keep you on the edge of your seat as it delves into the psyche of two people trapped in a dangerous, passionate bond. Will Maria learn to embrace the dark romance that has taken over her life, or will she continue to resist it? As she discovers the depth of Alejandro's control and influence, Maria is forced to confront the reality of her situation and the strange, undeniable attraction she feels toward him. This dark romance will leave you questioning the boundaries of love, power, and submission, as Maria faces the ultimate choice of whether to accept her fate or fight for her freedom.